We are talking today about topic 2.5. So we're continuing on with Unit 2, the interactions among the branches of government. And we're continuing on with really the executive branch, right? The power of the president. And today we're talking about checks on the presidency. Okay, so we're looking at ways in which the legislative branch and the judicial branch can check the power of the president. So we're looking at the learning objective, which says students will be able to explain how the president's agenda can create tension and frequent confrontations with Congress, right? So the president's agenda, these lists of goals, these policies that he wants to see enacted, right? For a conservative, it's going to be more so about protecting rights, particularly the Second Amendment, right? It's going to be about protecting economic freedoms, right? Protecting corporations, things like that, right? Whereas a liberal, a Democratic president is going to be more concerned with the expansion of rights, right? Making sure that all people are equally protected under the law, including disadvantaged groups, extending rights to minorities, women, children, and basically making sure that the United States is a melting pot for immigration and different ideas, right? So depending on what party the president's of, he's going to have a different agenda for him or herself and also their party. But this can often lead to obviously confrontations with Congress, right? Congress passes laws. We talked about the president's role as basically the as a president, he can veto laws or he can sign bills into law, right? He's responsible for seeing those laws are carried out. So the essential knowledge says that the potential for conflict with the Senate depends upon the type of executive branch appointments, right? And a lot of this has to do with, is it a divided government or is it a unified government, right? If it's a divided government, the confrontations are going to become more frequent, right? That the president cannot just appoint anybody to those positions, right? The president can't appoint a very conservative, very liberal person to those positions because the Senate won't confirm it, right? So in a divided government, they need to look for, we talk about merit, the merit system, and people that are qualified for their jobs, and that becomes much more prevalent in a divided government, right? In a unified government, there's not as much confrontation. There might be some disagreement on things, and I'll talk about one of those today. But generally, that as long as the president and the Senate can agree on a person, the party agrees on that person, it's a lot easier. So we're talking about cabinet members, right? Remember the cabinet members really are the makeup of these heads of the 15 executive departments, right? Those 15 executive departments, which had been developed over time, created first by George Washington with the state, treasury, and war, which eventually becomes defense. And the most recent addition to the departments, executive department, was the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11, right? So these departments are headed by these secretaries, right, which are appointed by the president. And great example here is when the president takes over, right? He often is responsible for, he appoints thousands of people to government, right? And some of his first appointments are his cabinet, the heads of those departments. When Donald Trump became president, he was tasked with appointing a head of the Department of Education, right, the Secretary of Education, and his appointment was very controversial amongst Democrats and Republicans alike. Even though the Senate was controlled by the Republicans, right, he appointed Nancy DeVos as the head of the Department of Education, and a lot of people objected to this because of her background, right? She had very little background in education. She was really a businesswoman, and a lot of people objected to that, and especially teachers and The education department was not happy about that appointment. And even in a unified government, which was controlled, the Senate was controlled by Republicans. It was a Republican president. You would think this process would go along pretty smoothly, but it didn't. In fact, it ended up in a tie, right? Even though the Republicans had the majority, there were Republicans that voted no for her, and it ended up in a tie. And we know that if the Senate is tied, the tie-breaking vote is the vice president, right? So Vice President Pence got to break the tie. Obviously, Donald Trump appointed it. Mike Pence was his vice president. He voted to confirm her. So she was approved by a 51-50 vote in the Senate. Same thing with ambassadors, right? Ambassadors are United States representatives appointed by the president to serve in foreign countries, right? So the president appoints these ambassadors to serve in foreign countries. They go there and they live in the embassy and they represent United States interests and the policy agenda of the president and that party in foreign countries. And just like with all of the appointments, right, the cabinet heads are appointed by the president but must be confirmed by the Senate. Ambassadors are the same way. They are appointed by the president but must be confirmed with a majority vote by the Senate. And then the White House staff. The White House staff is the exception, right? This is the exception to the Senate confirmation. It's one of the only positions that doesn't require Senate approval, right? The White House staff are the close aides, the staff members appointed by the president. His chief of staff is often a close confidant and close advisor to the president. The White House staff are basically these aides that are appointed by the president but don't need to be confirmed by the Senate. Why not? Because they really don't have a role in government, right? Their job is just basically to be an aide or an advisor to the president. So therefore, because they have little role in government, they oftentimes they're not required to be confirmed by the Senate, but often those appointments, right, are often too very controversial because they don't need to be approved by the Senate. The president can look for more ideologically left or right members to appoint to those positions. Look at Donald Trump. One of his aides was his son-in-law, right? Jared Kushner, who was his son-in-law, was one of his aides, one of the key members on his White House staff. So that can cause, obviously, some confrontation between the president and the Senate, right? So Senate confirmation. We know that almost all presidential appointments require Senate confirmation, a majority vote in the Senate, except for the White House staff. So that is a key check, a key limitation on the president's power, right? To keep him from appointing just anybody, the Senate can vote to accept or reject those nominations. So it's an important check on appointment power, but the president's lasting influence lies in life-tenured judicial appointments. These are probably the most important appointments the president makes. Why? Because they serve for life, right? Federal judges, Supreme Court judges, district court judges, appellate court judges serve for life. So when the president makes those appointments, right, he looks to appoint like-minded people. And once those people are on the court, the only way they can be removed is by impeachment, right? So oftentimes, the ability to claim the courts, to take the courts when it comes to their party or their ideologies is very important to those judges or to those presidents, right? So even the president, the most they can be there is really, 10 years under the 22nd Amendment, but 2 terms, right, or 10 years at the most. If the vice president takes over for the president, he can serve 2 more terms if serves less than 2 years. But those judges can serve 10, 20, 30, 40 years, right? So that has a lasting impact on future policy, particularly when we're talking about the policy agenda. So conservative judges sitting on the court are going to rule conservatively, right? Liberal judges sitting on the court are going to rule liberally. And those are all basically appointed by the president. They are subject to Senate approval, so they do need to be confirmed by the Senate. Divided government versus unified government often can impact those decisions and those appointments. When it's a unified government, the Senate and the president are the same party. The president can look for much more ideologically judges, right? Judges that are more extreme in their ideologies. If it's a divided government, if there are different parties, then the president has to look for more moderate judges. And then policy initiatives and executive orders promoted by the president often lead to conflict with the congressional agenda. Again, right, if this is a divided government, we know that president can enter into executive orders which have the effect of law, right, but don't need to be confirmed by Senate or Congress. So oftentimes those can come into conflict, especially in a divided government, with congressional agenda, what Congress wants to pass. So gridlock, if gridlock happens, right, an inability of Congress and the president to pass laws, sometimes executive orders do become more prominent because the president has the ability to enter into those orders without needing approval of Congress. But that often, as you can imagine, creates confrontation and some disagreement between the president and Congress as far as implementing and carrying out policy agenda. So that is topic 2.5, checks on the presidency. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Bye.